Don't let imposter syndrome or the wish to be perfect get in your way. The only way to overcome imposter syndrome is to do the thing you're feeling imposter-like in doing. That's the only cure. If your mindset is one of continuous improvement, you'll be able to tackle this much more effectively. In this week's episode, I'm discussing continuous improvement, specifically the spirit with which I launched this podcast, what you can learn from my experience. I cover a lot of ground, including how podcast rankings work and why I encourage you to start your podcast. Hello and welcome to Brandtuned, the show for entrepreneurs where we discuss personal and business brands to give you ideas and inspiration to stand out, win business, and be heard in a noisy world. I'm Shireen Smith, lawyer, author, and curious business owner, keen to uncover what moves the needle in branding. Topics I explore include how the brand impacts your success once it's been designed. Design means how things work, not just how they look. So how does the brand help you to reach success so you have more time, more money, and less stress? What role does intellectual property and brand protection play in that success? And what's involved to monetize your brand using franchising or licensing? Subscribe to the podcast and find out more. Although this isn't the summer anyone planned or wanted, one of the pleasant outcomes for me personally is that my daughters are here to stay with us for 2 weeks right now. Now, I hadn't seen them since February. The eldest had spent the last few months at her boyfriend's parents' house working from there. She was about to give notice to leave her flat so they could find somewhere to live together when the lockdown happened. She's only just managed to move out of her own flat. Now, to do it, she had to get there, obviously, pack so the removers could take everything to store. My other daughter, her sister, helped her to pack, and then the two of them came to stay for 2 weeks because the eldest's boyfriend has asthma and therefore is in a vulnerable category. So she wanted to be sure not to put him at risk through this move of hers. Having anyone to stay for 2 weeks is unusual in today's fast-paced economy and kind of reminds me of those Jane Austen novels that I used to read, where people went and stayed with relatives for months or weeks at a time. It's really lovely to have them here. While continuous improvement has a specific meaning, something to do with a method for achieving excellence, whereby organizations identify opportunities to streamline work and reduce waste, known as lean, agile, or Kaizen, I'm not using the term in this sense here at all. I'm just using the ordinary dictionary meaning of the words. For me, continuous improvement is a philosophy for life and business. If I want to do something like set up a podcast, I bear in mind that I can continuously improve it. This reduces the pressure when you know you're going to be far from perfect or excellent. That's the spirit in which I launched this podcast without feeling stressed about it. So get going on whatever it is you want to do, knowing you'll be able to work on improving it as you get more experience. By giving yourself permission to try something without worrying about the fact that there may be a lot of room for improvement, due to your inexperience, you give yourself more of a chance to actually achieve great things. You'll be able to get going much more quickly and stand a greater chance of achieving your goals. How else are you going to get experience otherwise? You see, the future is uncertain right now, as it is as it was during the 2008 recession. Lots of people are losing their jobs and times are difficult for many people. However, there are positives in this because for some people, it may be an opportunity in disguise, a chance to try something different. Continuous improvement as a philosophy will help you on your entrepreneurial journey, be it setting up as a freelancer or as a business to get something done in the world. You'll develop new skills to succeed, and top among the skills you're going to need is the ability to market yourself. Now, unless you're a marketer by background, this necessarily involves continuously improving what you put out in the world. It's rarely possible to set something up and forget it, be it a website, a landing page, a course, or whatever. I'd recommend building your personal brand is a great starting point for marketing any activities. Why not set up a podcast to do this? The subject doesn't necessarily need to involve your core business or services either. I'd suggest podcasting because it's the next marketing frontier. The shift to mobile and people's lack of time are just two reasons why podcasts are increasingly popular. See, we may all be too busy to sit down to read a book, but it's easy enough to consume content, during times that would otherwise go to waste. If you want to learn, then listening to a podcast or an audiobook during a commute, when you're exercising, cooking, cleaning, and so on, is a great way to make time to do it. There are far fewer podcasts than blogs, so there is less noise, and podcasts are a good way to communicate a message to a wider audience or to just convey your personality to the world. However, there is a lot to learn and get right if you want to have a successful podcast. But until you try it, you can't improve your skills. So instead of procrastinating with podcasting, trying to find the perfect podcast cover, name, theme, and the like, just make some choices and get going. The key is to find a way to do it cost effectively. Now, many people sell very expensive podcasting packages. Now, if you're starting a new business, I don't think it's worth spending serious money to get a podcast up and running. Instead, when you're wanting to experiment and get going with podcasting, I suggest signing up for a free account with Buzzsprout and reading their resources and guides. Then join their Facebook group and either do your own editing or find an editor to help if you don't want to do it yourself, but just get started. Which brings me back to the subject of today's podcast, continuous improvement. Now, it's important when tackling something new like podcasting to move forward with confidence and certainty. Don't let imposter syndrome or the wish to be perfect get in your way. The only way to overcome imposter syndrome is to do the thing you're feeling imposter-like in doing. That's the only cure. If your mindset is one of continuous improvement, you'll be able to tackle this much more effectively. It's so possible with podcasting to make changes to your podcast and refine and improve it over time. Even if you decide it's not the right podcast for you to have started, you can just scrap it and start again with another podcast. If you don't start, you don't learn. Get used to being outside your comfort zone by starting things, even though they will be less than perfect, and then focus on continuously learning and improving. I'm sure that's the way to grow. It's a mindset that serves me well in everything I do. Now, getting started and perfecting as you go is the spirit in which I started this podcast. I had an idea what sort of topics I wanted to cover because I'm writing a book on brands and branding, and wanted the podcast to be a useful resource for readers of the book. At the back of my mind was the idea that I would probably have to do 100 episodes to really hone my podcasting skills, if not more. This is the 20th episode of the podcast. That's a landmark of sorts, 1/5 of the way to 100. I decided to take stock and narrow my focus to 3 specific benefits that listeners will get from each episode moving forward. The yardstick by which I will measure the success of every episode is: how will this either save listeners time or make them more money or reduce their stress? That's what success involves for most of us. Rather than being an undefined term, I wanted to double down on what moves the needle to achieving success in business. Take your time as you create your podcast, if that's what you decide to do. The way I went about it was to create 10 episodes before launching. I then launched 4 episodes and followed that by releasing 2 episodes a week while I created content for future episodes. This meant I had a few podcasts in hand in case I became too busy to record an episode one week. I intended to produce a weekly episode. I've since read that it's worth launching a podcast with 30 or so episodes in one go. That gives listeners a choice of episodes to listen to and ensures you remain a top-ranking podcast for longer while you develop more episodes. You see, the longer your podcast is in the top-ranking categories, the more chance you have to attract new listeners. Certainly, when I launched brandtuned, I ranked in the 10th spot for UK marketing podcasts straight away. That declined rapidly so that now I don't appear in the top 200 UK marketing podcasts at all. However, I've noticed that podcasts often move in and out of the charts. Sometimes I appear in other categories, such as the top 1,000 global business podcasts, and a podcast that had been in the top 100 marketing podcasts just a week previously suddenly doesn't rank in any charts at all. So you can view how other podcasts are doing on Chartable, and I'm encouraged to note that a number of podcasts that I listen to don't currently appear in the rankings at all. From this, I've deduced that podcast rankings are quite fluid, and ultimately ranking among the top podcasts is a nice to have rather than an essential aspect of having a successful podcast. The more consistently you rank, the more exposure your podcast gets. However, it's perfectly possible to work your way into the rankings at any time. The trick is to stay in the rankings. So if ranking is important to you, that could be one yardstick by which to assess your continuous improvement efforts. I was and still am very much outside my comfort zone interviewing guests. As with everything in life, practice makes perfect. You must be willing to put in the effort whenever you approach a new skill to learn as you go. I'm already feeling a lot more comfortable with the interview format. Getting a bank of podcasts in place before you launch your podcast means you can get started much less stressfully. You can approach people over time and record sessions gradually. I decided to stick to a 30-minute podcast format initially and approached some guests using a standard sort of wording, which I gradually developed and improved. One of my earliest conversations was with Daniel Priestley. Daniel runs business accelerators for entrepreneurs, which provide a combination of training and accountability, peer-to-peer group networking, mentoring, and access to tools and resources. His company, Dent, develops entrepreneurs to stand out in a noisy marketplace and to scale their businesses to their full potential. Now, I was keen to discover how his approach to branding his own business was achieved, because the brand he's created is actually quite cult-like in the evangelism it attracts within his community. Daniel has many qualities, one of which is his great sense of humor and generosity of spirit. Another guest was Susan Payton, who has made storytelling the center of her business. Story is hugely relevant to brands, so I wanted to feature an episode on this topic. We discussed how stories help businesses to articulate what they do in a way that customers can relate to. Another of my guests was David B. Horn, whose book, Add, Then Multiply, really piqued my interest. His methodology for scaling businesses involves getting funding, acquiring other businesses, consolidating, and then achieving a good exit value. He described his approach to helping businesses grow at levels that are just not normally achieved. I began preparing to launch my podcast back in January. The interviews took place gradually between February and May, so it's very easy to create a podcast if you give yourself plenty of time to prepare. You grow in confidence interview by interview. Now, being a lawyer, I know a lot of other lawyers, so I wanted to interview Ronnie Fox, who is a high-profile lawyer with a very successful career behind him. He's worth listening to if you want to develop your personal brand, because it's very clear from listening to this episode just how important it is to have a niche set of skills. Will Critchlow is someone I've known since 2005, when he just started his business. In the early days, the business was known as Wand. He and his co-founder rebranded it to Distilled after a year or so. They went on to build a highly respected international SEO consultancy, which they recently sold. So I wanted to find out how he had approached branding. Interestingly, Will didn't consciously create a brand strategy. For him, reputation came first, ahead of the brand. As the business grew and they hired additional staff, they actually looked at what the whole organization stood for, what was their meaning in the marketplace, as that was necessary for recruitment and retention of the right people. If your marketing involves creating content, then you'll understand the value of getting a podcast up and running. Creating one has certainly allowed me to reach a brand new audience of people who might otherwise never have found or consumed my content. It's because they prefer the audio format that they're listening to my podcast. You don't need to be an established content creator to become a successful podcaster. A podcast is an excellent way to build an audience from scratch and position yourself as an authority in your industry. And as with anything in life, success doesn't come overnight. In addition, podcasts also provide the potential to drive traffic back to your website or store. Every podcast directory gives you a link back to your website. And since it's your podcast, you can direct listeners to your website at the end of each show. If you decide to launch your own podcast, do let me know when it's up and running and I'll listen to it. Now, I'm hoping to continuously improve this podcast and to gradually work my way into the top 200 podcasts in the categories I've selected. I'm fully expecting this to take time and aim to do this in the long term. Bye. That's it for this week. Do subscribe to the brandtuned newsletter to get weekly updates. I'd also love to get your feedback. Just send me an email to info@brandtuned.com. Finally, if you liked the episode, please do share it with your friends and colleagues and review it on iTunes or whichever platform you use to listen to podcasts. If you leave us a 5-star review, it means more people will listen and we can spread the word much more quickly about the podcast. Thank you and bye for now.